Picture this. You wake up on a Tuesday morning ready to head to work like any other day. You grab your coffee, check your phone, and walk outside to your truck. But something is wrong, very wrong. There is a bright yellow metal clamp locked around your front tire, a boot, on your own truck, in your own driveway, on your own property. The rage that filled my chest in that moment was unlike anything I had ever felt. This was not just about a parking violation. This was about power. This was about control. This was about a petty tyrant who thought she could destroy my livelihood because she did not like the look of my work truck. But Karen Williams had no idea what she had just started. She thought she was dealing with just another neighbor who would bend to her will. She was wrong, dead wrong. That morning changed everything. Because sometimes, when someone pushes you too far, you have to push back. And I was about to push back in a way that would make her regret the day she ever messed with me. My name is Mike, and 6 months ago I thought I had found the perfect place to call home. After years of apartment living and building my contracting business, I finally had enough saved for a down payment on a house in Meadowbrook Estates. It looked like paradise. Neat lawns, quiet streets, and a community clubhouse that seemed to promise the kind of neighborhood where kids could ride bikes and neighbors actually knew each other. I should have known it was too good to be true. My work truck is everything to me. It is a 2019 Ford F-250, white with my company logo on the side. Nothing fancy, but it is clean, well-maintained, and carries all the tools I need to make a living. When you run a small electrical contracting business like I do, your truck is not just transportation. It is your mobile office, your storage unit, and your lifeline to paying the bills. During the home buying process, I made sure to ask about any restrictions. The real estate agent handed me a thick packet of HOA documents and said the usual things. Keep your grass cut, do not paint your house purple, pick up after your dog. Standard stuff that any reasonable person would follow. I skimmed through it, signed where I needed to sign, and figured I was good to go. The first few weeks were great. I introduced myself to neighbors, kept my property neat, and even attended a HOA meeting to show I was interested in being part of the community. Everything seemed normal. I parked my truck in my driveway every night after work, just like I had been doing for years at my old place. Then came the first letter. It arrived on a Wednesday, typed on official HOA letterhead with my address printed in bold at the top. Notice of covenant violation, it said in red letters. I read it twice before the words sank in. Dear Mr. Henderson, it has come to our attention that you are parking a commercial vehicle in your driveway in violation of Section 4.2 of the Community Covenants. Commercial vehicles are prohibited from overnight parking in residential driveways. Please remedy this situation within 7 days or face additional fines and enforcement action. I sat at my kitchen table staring at that letter, feeling confused and frustrated. Commercial vehicle. It was just my work truck. Half the guys in my old neighborhood had work trucks. Nobody ever cared as long as you were not running a business out of your garage or making noise at weird hours. That night, I dug out the HOA documents and read through them more carefully. Section 4.2 was buried on page 23, written in the kind of legal language that could mean almost anything depending on who was interpreting it. The definition of commercial vehicle was vague enough to include practically any truck with a company logo. I decided to be reasonable about it. Maybe there was just some misunderstanding. Maybe I could work something out with the HOA board. I had always been the kind of person who believed that most problems could be solved if people just talked to each other like adults. I was about to learn how wrong I could be. The next morning, I called the number on the letterhead and asked to speak with someone about the violation notice. The woman who answered the phone had a tone that immediately put me on edge. "This is Karen Williams, HOA president. What can I do for you?" I explained who I was and asked if we could discuss the commercial vehicle issue. Maybe there was some flexibility in the rules, or some way to get a variance since my truck was clean and well maintained. "Mr. Henderson, the rules are the rules. They exist for a reason. This is a residential community, not a construction site. If you wanted to park work trucks, you should have bought property in an industrial area." Her voice was cold, dismissive, like she was talking to a child who did not understand why he could not have candy for dinner. "Mrs. Williams, I understand the community wants to maintain standards, but this is just my personal work truck. I am not running a business out of my house or disturbing anyone. Is there any way we can work something out?" The board voted on this issue years ago. Commercial vehicles lower property values and create an unprofessional appearance. You have 7 days to comply. End of discussion. The line went dead. Over the next few days, I started paying attention to Karen Williams. She was a woman in her mid-50s who seemed to have made HOA enforcement her full-time job. Every morning around 9, she would walk through the neighborhood with a clipboard looking for violations. Dead flowers, grass that was a quarter-inch too long, trash cans left out past pickup day. Nothing was too small for her attention. I watched her stop and take photos of my truck from different angles. She measured the distance from my bumper to the sidewalk. She even walked up my driveway to peer through the windows and document the tools in my truck bed. The second letter arrived 5 days later. This time it was a final notice, with a threat of fines starting at $50 per day if I did not comply immediately. But here is the thing that really got to me. The letter was dated the same day as my phone call with Karen. She had already decided to escalate before we even talked. I tried attending the next HOA board meeting to address the issue in person. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a nice building with a conference room and kitchen that residents could rent for events. Karen sat at the head of the table like she was running a corporate board meeting instead of a neighborhood association. When I stood up to speak during the public comment period, Karen cut me off before I could finish my first sentence. "Mr. Henderson, we have already discussed your situation. The rules are clear and they apply to everyone equally." "But Mrs. Williams, I am not asking for special treatment. I just want to understand why my clean, well-maintained truck is considered a problem when there are cars in this neighborhood that look far worse. Are you suggesting that other residents are in violation? Because if you have specific complaints, you can submit them in writing." The other board members just sat there, nodding along with whatever Karen said. It was clear that she ran the show and nobody was willing to challenge her. That night, I started researching Karen Williams online. What I found was disturbing. She had been HOA president for 8 years. During that time, the community had gone through 3 different property management companies because of complaints about her heavy-handed enforcement tactics. There were posts on neighborhood forums from former residents who had sold their homes just to get away from her constant harassment. But the final straw came 2 weeks later. I woke up that Tuesday morning, walked outside with my coffee, and saw the boot locked around my tire. No warning, no phone call, just a bright yellow metal clamp that made it impossible for me to get to work. The rage that filled my chest was unlike anything I had ever felt. This was not just about rules or property values anymore. This was personal. Karen Williams had just declared war on my ability to make a living. She had no idea what she had started. The first thing I did was call a locksmith. No way was I going to let Karen Williams cost me a day of work over her power trip. While I waited for him to arrive, I took photos of everything. The boot, the truck, the notice taped to my windshield. If this was going to be a fight, I was going to document every single detail. The locksmith showed up an hour later, took one look at the situation, and shook his head. "Man, I see this stuff all the time. HOA boards think they can do whatever they want. You know this is probably illegal, right? They cannot just boot vehicles on private property without a court order." That got my attention fast. "What do you mean illegal?" "Unless your HOA has some very specific legal authority, which most do not, they cannot immobilize vehicles on private driveways. That is basically theft of your ability to use your own property." 20 minutes and $200 later, my truck was free, but my mind was racing. If what the locksmith said was true, then Karen had just made a serious mistake, a mistake I could use. That afternoon, instead of going to work, I went to the county courthouse. I spent hours in the records office, pulling every document I could find related to Meadowbrook Estates and the HOA. Property deeds, incorporation papers, financial filings, meeting minutes from the County Planning Commission. I wanted to understand exactly what kind of authority the HOA actually had. What I discovered was fascinating. The HOA had been incorporated as a nonprofit, but they had never filed the proper paperwork to become a legal enforcement entity. They had no authority to immobilize vehicles, levy fines, or place liens on property. They were basically a social club with delusions of grandeur. But the really interesting stuff was in the financial records. As a nonprofit, the HOA had to file annual reports with the state. Karen Williams had been signing these reports as president, and some of the numbers did not add up. There were payments to companies that I could not find any record of, consulting fees that seemed excessive for a small neighborhood association. I started digging deeper into the property records around the clubhouse. The HOA owned the building and the immediate grounds, but there was something odd about the access situation. The only vehicle entrance to the clubhouse parking area was through a narrow driveway that ran along the back edge of a vacant lot. That vacant lot was not owned by the HOA. It was privately owned by an investment company that had been trying to sell it for years. And here is the kicker. There was no recorded easement giving the HOA permanent access across that property. I sat in my truck outside the courthouse, staring at the property survey maps spread across my passenger seat. The HOA clubhouse was essentially landlocked, without access across that vacant lot. They had been using that driveway for years, probably assuming they had some kind of permanent right to it. But assumptions are not the same as legal rights. That evening, I called the phone number listed on the "For Sale" sign that had been sitting on that vacant lot for months. A tired-sounding real estate agent answered on the third ring. "Yeah, that property has been a tough sell. It is a weird shape, and the access situation is complicated. The previous owner used to let the HOA use the driveway, but there is no formal easement. Most developers do not want to deal with that kind of potential conflict." What would someone need to do to buy it? Well, it has been on the market for 2 years. The owners are motivated. Are you thinking about developing it? I looked across the street at the clubhouse, where Karen Williams was probably planning her next violation notice campaign. Something like that. What are they asking? The vacant lot was priced at $85,000. For most people, that would be a fortune to spend on revenge. But I had been saving money for years, living below my means and building my business. I had the cash, and more importantly, I had the motivation. Over the next week, I visited that lot every day. I walked the property lines, studied the survey markers, and measured the distance from the street to the clubhouse driveway. The lot was a long, narrow strip of land that ran behind several houses and wrapped around the back of the clubhouse property. The HOA had been using about 50 feet of frontage along the back edge to access their parking area. Without that access, the clubhouse was essentially useless. Sure, people could walk to it from the neighborhood, but nobody could drive there for events, meetings, or maintenance. The building would become a very expensive lawn ornament. The more I studied the situation, the more brilliant it seemed. Karen Williams had spent years using the HOA rules as a weapon against residents who did not conform to her vision of suburban perfection. She had cost people thousands of dollars in fines and legal fees. She had forced families to sell their homes rather than deal with her harassment. Now I had found her weakness. The clubhouse was her symbol of power, the place where she held court and made her pronouncements about proper community standards. Without access to it, her authority would crumble. But I had to be smart about this. If Karen found out what I was planning, she might try to get the HOA to buy the lot first, or lobby the city to create some kind of emergency access easement. I needed to move fast and keep quiet. I called the real estate agent back and arranged to meet the property owners. They turned out to be a retired couple who had inherited the land from a relative and just wanted to get rid of it. They had no emotional attachment to the property and no interest in getting involved in neighborhood politics. "We have been paying property taxes on this thing for 15 years, the husband told me. At this point, we would take $70,000 just to be done with it. I offered $75,000 cash with a closing date in 2 weeks. They accepted immediately. Next, I needed legal advice. I found a property attorney who specialized in access rights and easements. His name was David Chen, and he had a reputation for being thorough and aggressive when necessary. "This is an interesting situation," he said after reviewing the property records. "The HOA has been using that access for years, but without a recorded easement, they have no legal right to continue. If you buy the property, you can absolutely restrict access. Are there any ways they could challenge this? They could try to claim an easement by prescription, meaning they have used the access for so long that they have earned a legal right to it. But that requires continuous, open, and hostile use for a specific period of time. Since they have been using it with the owner's permission, that claim would be weak. What about the city? Could they force me to allow access? Not unless there are specific zoning requirements or emergency access issues. And even then, they would have to pay fair compensation for any easement they created." David helped me structure the purchase to minimize any potential challenges. We would close on a Friday afternoon, after business hours, so I would have the weekend to secure the property before anyone realized what had happened. The plan was simple but effective. Once I owned the lot, I would install a gate across the access driveway and post clear, "No trespassing" signs. The HOA could continue to use the clubhouse for walking meetings, but their days of hosting large events and throwing their weight around were over. I spent the next 2 weeks watching Karen Williams continue her reign of terror. She cited a neighbor for having Christmas lights up past January 15th. She measured the height of another resident's fence and determined it was 3 inches too tall. She sent violation notices to a family whose teenage son had been parking his car on the street instead of in their driveway. Every petty abuse of power just made me more determined to see this through. The closing was scheduled for Friday, January 20th at 3 p.m. I had already arranged for a contractor to install security fencing and gates first thing Monday morning. By the time Karen Williams figured out what had happened, it would be too late to stop me. The closing went smoother than I could have hoped. The sellers were so eager to get rid of the property that they had already signed most of the paperwork in advance. By 4 p.m. on Friday afternoon, I was holding the deed to the most strategically important piece of land in Meadowbrook Estates. That weekend, while Karen Williams was probably planning her next round of violation notices, I was busy transforming my new property. I had hired Jake Morrison, a contractor who specialized in security fencing and gates. He owed me a favor from some electrical work I had done at his shop, and he was more than happy to work over the weekend for overtime pay. "So let me get this straight," Jake said as we walked the property line Saturday morning. "You bought this whole lot just to mess with your HOA president." "I bought this lot to exercise my property rights," I corrected him. "What I do with my own land is nobody else's business." Jake grinned. "Man, I wish I had thought of something like this when my HOA was giving me grief about my boat trailer." By Sunday evening, we had installed a 6-foot chain link fence along the back edge of the property, with a locked gate across the driveway access point. The gate was solid steel, painted black, with clear private property, no trespassing signs mounted on both sides. There was no way anyone could miss the message. But Karen was not making it easy to stay focused on the project. Even while I was working on the lot, she continued her harassment campaign against my truck. On Saturday morning, I found another violation notice on my windshield, this time threatening legal action if I did not comply within 48 hours. The irony was delicious. In less than 24 hours, Karen Williams was going to discover that her days of threatening people were over. I had David Chen review every aspect of the fencing and signage to make sure everything was legally bulletproof. The property lines were clearly marked, the fence was built entirely on my land, and the access restriction was completely within my rights as the property owner. "They are going to be furious," David warned me. "Are you prepared for the backlash?" "I have been dealing with their backlash for months. At least now it will be on my terms." Monday morning arrived with perfect weather. Clear skies, mild temperature, and excellent visibility for Karen Williams to see exactly what had happened to her precious clubhouse access. I got up early and positioned myself at my kitchen window with a cup of coffee, waiting for the show to begin. The HOA had a board meeting scheduled for that evening, and I knew Karen would want to check on the clubhouse beforehand to make sure everything was ready. At 8:47 a.m., Karen's silver Mercedes pulled up to the gate. I watched her get out of the car and stare at the fence in obvious confusion. She walked up to the gate and tried to push it open, then noticed the lock and the no trespassing signs. Even from my house, I could see her face turning red with anger. She pulled out her phone and made several calls, packing back and forth in front of the gate. I imagined she was calling other board members, maybe the property management company, trying to figure out what was happening and who was responsible. After about 10 minutes, she got back in her car and drove away. But I knew this was just the beginning. An hour later, a sheriff's deputy knocked on my door. Karen had apparently called the police to report trespassing and property damage. The officer was professional but thorough, asking to see my property deed and permits for the fence installation. "Everything looks legitimate to me," he said after reviewing the paperwork. "You have every right to fence your own property and restrict access. The complainant seems to think she has some kind of easement, but I do not see anything in the county records. She has been using that access for years, but only with the previous owner's permission. I am the new owner, and I am not giving permission." The deputy nodded. "That is your right. Just make sure you do not block any public roads or emergency access routes. The fence is entirely on my property, and there are other ways to reach the clubhouse on foot." After the deputy left, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and anticipation. The first shot had been fired, and Karen Williams now knew she was in a fight. But she had no idea how thoroughly I had prepared for this battle, or how much ammunition I still had in reserve. The real confrontation was still to come. The emergency HOA board meeting was called for 7 p.m. that Monday. I knew about it because Karen had sent a notice to every resident in the neighborhood, claiming there was a security emergency that required immediate attention. She probably hoped to rally the community against me before I had a chance to explain my side of the story. It did not work out the way she planned. I arrived at the clubhouse at 6:55 p.m., parking on the street since the back entrance was now blocked. The building was already packed with curious neighbors who wanted to know what the emergency was all about. I took a seat in the back row and waited for the fireworks to begin. Karen called the meeting to order with her usual authoritative tone, but I could see the stress in her face. Her perfect composure was starting to crack. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a serious situation that threatens the security and property values of our entire community. An individual has illegally blocked access to our clubhouse, effectively holding our community property hostage." She gestured toward the back of the room where I was sitting. "Mr. Henderson has built an unauthorized fence that prevents residents from using facilities that we all pay for through our HOA dues." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as people turned to look at me. Some faces showed anger, others confusion, and a few seemed more curious than upset. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. "Karen, nothing I have done is illegal. I purchased private property and built a fence on that property. I have every legal right to control access to my own land. You have no right to interfere with established community access routes." "Actually, I do. There is no recorded easement giving the HOA permanent access across that property. You have been using it for years without legal permission from the previous owners." The room erupted in surprised chatter. Most residents had no idea that the clubhouse access was not legally secured. Karen's face was getting redder by the minute. "This is ridiculous. We have been using that driveway for over a decade, with permission from owners who chose to allow it. I am the new owner, and I am not giving that permission. This is nothing but spite. You are trying to punish the entire community because you do not want to follow simple parking rules." That comment was a mistake on her part, because it reminded everyone about the ongoing harassment I had been dealing with. "Karen, you had my truck booted in my own driveway. You have been sending me threatening letters for months over a clean, well-maintained work vehicle. You have made my life miserable with your petty power trips and your selective enforcement of rules." I pulled out a folder full of documents and violation notices. "But this is not about my truck anymore. This is about a pattern of abuse that has been going on for years." I turned to address the room directly. "How many of you have been harassed by Karen Williams over minor violations? How many of you have paid fines for grass that was supposedly too long, or Christmas decorations that stayed up past her arbitrary deadlines?" Several hands went up around the room, then more hands. Within seconds, over half the people in the room were raising their hands. "This is what happens when someone gets drunk on a tiny bit of power," I continued. Karen has turned this HOA into her personal kingdom, where she gets to decide who follows the rules and who gets punished. You cannot just block community access because you are upset about parking violations, Karen shouted. Actually, I can. It is my property and I have every legal right to control access. But I am not unreasonable. I am willing to discuss a solution. The room went quiet, sensing that this was the crucial moment. Here are my terms. First, the HOA needs to acknowledge that I have the right to park my work truck in my own driveway without harassment. Second, Karen Williams needs to resign as HOA president. And third, the board needs to establish clear, fair enforcement policies that apply equally to everyone. This is extortion, Karen screamed. You cannot hold community property hostage to get your way. I am not holding anything hostage. I am exercising my property rights. The clubhouse is still accessible on foot. You just cannot drive to it anymore unless we reach an agreement. Board member Tom Martinez, who had been quiet throughout the meeting, finally spoke up. Karen, is it true that there is no legal easement for the driveway access? Karen hesitated for the first time all evening. Well, the legal situation is complicated. It is not complicated at all, I said. I have a property attorney who has reviewed all the records. The HOA has been using that access illegally for years. You just never got caught until now. The room erupted in angry voices, but most of the anger was now directed at Karen rather than at me. People were realizing that their HOA president had been operating on shaky legal ground while wielding her authority like a weapon against residents. I will not be blackmailed by a disgruntled resident, Karen declared. This board will pursue legal action to restore proper access to community facilities. Good luck with that, I replied calmly. I look forward to seeing you in court. Karen Williams hired a lawyer, just like she threatened. It cost the HOA $15,000 in legal fees to learn what I already knew. I had every right to control access to my own property. The attorney Karen hired was not as thorough as David Chen. He filed a motion for emergency access, claiming that the HOA had established an easement through continuous use. But he had not done his homework on the previous owners or the permission arrangements that had been in place. David destroyed their case in less than an hour of testimony. He presented documentation showing that the previous owners had explicitly granted permission for HOA access, which meant the use was not hostile, as required for a prescriptive easement claim. He also demonstrated that the HOA had never maintained the driveway or paid any costs associated with its use, further undermining their claim to permanent rights. The judge was not impressed with the HOA's case. It appears that your organization has been operating under an assumption rather than a legal right. Mr. Henderson is under no obligation to continue arrangements made by previous property owners. But the real victory came at the next HOA meeting, 2 weeks later. Karen Williams was facing a revolt from the residents. People had started comparing notes about her enforcement tactics, and the stories were damning. A family had been fined $300 because their garbage can was visible from the street. An elderly man had been threatened with legal action because his rose bushes were 6 inches over the property line. A single mother had been harassed for weeks because her teenager's friends parked on the street during a birthday party. The petition to remove Karen from the board had 67 signatures out of 96 households in the neighborhood. Tom Martinez called me the day before the meeting. Mike, we are ready to accept your terms. Karen is going to resign, and we want to negotiate a reasonable access agreement for the clubhouse. What about my truck? We are going to revise the commercial vehicle policy. Clean, well-maintained work trucks will be allowed in driveways. No more harassment over vehicles that are not actually causing problems. The final meeting was anticlimactic. Karen Williams submitted her resignation letter and left without saying a word. The new board president, Sandra Chen, was a retired teacher who believed in common sense over power trips. We negotiated a simple access agreement. The HOA could use the driveway for special events and meetings, but they had to give me notice and maintain the roadway at their expense. In return, I would keep the gate unlocked during designated hours and work with them on any reasonable scheduling conflicts. The neighborhood has been peaceful ever since. The new board focuses on actual community improvements rather than hunting for violations. Property values have actually gone up because people no longer fear being harassed over minor issues. Karen Williams moved out of Meadowbrook Estates 6 months later. I heard she bought a house in a neighborhood without an HOA. As for my truck, it sits in my driveway every night without a single complaint. Sometimes the simplest victories are the sweetest ones. The whole experience taught me something important about standing up to bullies. They count on people being afraid to fight back, being too intimidated by their authority to challenge their abuse of power. But bullies are often operating on much shakier ground than they want you to believe. Sometimes you just have to be willing to call their bluff.